All right, let's jump right into a huge topic in sociology, deviance. Now, when you hear that word, your mind probably goes straight to crime or maybe some really strange behavior. But for sociologists, the meaning is so much deeper and honestly, way more interesting than that. So let's get into it. Take a look at these three people. We've got a burglar, a guy with some pretty intense facial tattoos, and a woman with traditional scars. On the surface, what do they have in common? Not much, right? But in the eyes of some, society might lump them all under the same label, deviant. And that right there is the central puzzle we're going to explore. How in the world do we decide what counts as deviant? So what is deviance really? Well, the answer is a lot more complicated than you might think. And in this explainer, we are going to unpack the sociological answer. And I promise you, it'll give you a whole new lens for understanding how a society actually works. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by digging into the puzzle of deviance itself. Then we'll check out 4 competing definitions that sociologists have wrestled with. After that, we'll talk about the incredible power of social norms, ask the big question of who gets to make the rules, and finally wrap up with why deviance is always, always relative. Let's start with a really key idea. For sociologists, deviance doesn't automatically equal bad. It's not about making a moral judgment. Instead, it's any act, or even just a condition, that society collectively frowns upon or condemns. The focus isn't on the act itself, but on society's reaction to that act. You know, deviance is such a loaded term for a reason. What one person considers a dangerous act, another might see as just a lifestyle choice. I mean, think about the debates around things like getting extreme tattoos or even selling your own organs. People are going to disagree. And that disagreement is exactly what makes this whole topic so fascinating to study. So, because this idea is so slippery, sociologists have come at it from a few different angles. Let's walk through these competing definitions to really get a handle on what we're talking about. First up, we've got the statistical definition. This one's pretty simple. If a behavior is rare, it's deviant. But you can probably see the problem here right away. Being a genius is rare. Being an Olympic gold medalist is extremely rare. We definitely don't call those people deviant. So this approach just ends up confusing being different with being deviant. It doesn't really work. Okay, next is the absolutist definition. This perspective says some things are just inherently wrong, period. No matter the culture, no matter the time period. It assumes there are universal standards of right and wrong. The problem is, there aren't. This view totally ignores cultural differences and, maybe more importantly, it ignores the fact that powerful groups often get to decide what those universal standards are. Now we're getting warmer. The reactivist definition is all about the famous saying, deviance is in the eye of the beholder. This means an act is only deviant if people see it, react to it, and slap that label on it. This is a huge step because it puts the spotlight on social reaction. But it's still got a major flaw. For instance, if a burglar breaks into a house but never gets caught, was he not deviant? And this leads us to the one question that really stumps the reactivist view. If deviance is all about how people react, well, what tells them how to react? Why does a crowd get angry at one thing but applaud another? There must be some kind of shared rule book they're all working from, right? Some kind of blueprint for their reactions. And that brings us to the breakthrough, the normative definition. This is the one most sociologists land on. It defines deviance simply as a violation of social norms, those shared rules that tell us how to behave. This is the missing piece. It solves the puzzle because it focuses on the underlying rules that trigger the social reactions in the first place. So just to recap everything real quick. The statistical definition is all about rarity. The absolutist one is about universal wrongs. The reactivist one focuses on social labels. But the normative definition, the one about breaking social norms, that's the one that gives us the best sociological tool to really understand deviance. Okay, so since we've landed on the normative definition, we absolutely have to take a closer look at social norms. These are the unwritten and sometimes written rules that kind of run our social lives. So what are they exactly? Well, social norms are the expectations for how we're supposed to think, talk, and act in different situations. They're what makes social life predictable. You know, things like waiting your turn in line or not talking during a movie. Without norms, social interaction would just be chaos. They are the absolute bedrock of social order. And norms basically come in two flavors. You have proscriptive norms, which are the don'ts, so don't smoke in an elevator. And then you have prescriptive norms, which are the do's. You ought to wash your hands. Pretty straightforward. This brings us to a super critical question. If deviance is just the violation of norms, then who gets to create those norms in the first place? Who has the power to say, this is right and that is wrong? As we're about to see, the answer has everything to do with social power. Here's the bottom line. Some groups in society just have more power than others. And social power is the ability to make your rules the rules for everybody. Groups that control political, economic, or social resources can push their own norms and get them accepted as the standard for everyone. What this means is that the very definition of deviance often just reflects the values and interests of the most powerful people. And this brings us to what might be the single most important takeaway from all of this. Since norms are made by different groups and they change across cultures and over time, deviance is not some fixed, unchanging thing. It is fundamentally relative. What counts as deviant depends completely on the context. And this table illustrates the point perfectly. Take a look. Drinking a beer. For a bunch of fraternity members after a big win, totally normal. For a group of Baptist deacons after a church fundraiser, probably seen as pretty deviant. Same exact act, totally different context. It shows that it's not the act itself, but who's doing it, where they're doing it, and when they're doing it that really matters. The idea of subcultures makes this even clearer. You know, a subculture like the goth community or a youth gang is like a culture within a culture with its own set of rules and values. Something that the mainstream culture might condemn could be perfectly acceptable or maybe even encouraged within that subculture. It just goes to show you again how deviance is relative to whatever group you're in. So when you put it all together, you arrive at this really profound sociological insight. When we study what a society calls deviant, we're not just learning about the so-called deviance, we're learning a ton about that society's values, its fears, its moral boundaries, and its power structures. Deviance, in a way, is like a mirror that reflects the society that defines. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Norms are not set in stone. They're always changing. Just think about how our views on things like smoking or tattoos or divorce have radically shifted over time. So that raises a really fascinating question for all of us. What perfectly normal, everyday things are we doing right now that future generations will look back on and label as totally deviant? Makes you think, doesn't it?